The phone hasn't stopped ringing for 11 minutes. I count because counting keeps my hand steady around the coffee mug. Margaret's name flashes across the screen for the fourth time, then Caleb's, then a number I don't recognize. Somewhere behind those calls in a country club ballroom 200 miles from this lake, my husband's family is watching the future. They built collapse in real time. They think I did this to them. They think I planned it. What they don't know is that I've been waiting 6 weeks for a sealed envelope to catch up with a lie that's 12 years old. I let the phone ring itself quiet. It's a Saturday morning in early June, the kind of morning that used to mean nothing more than opening the windows and letting the lake air move through the house. I'm sitting at the small pine table in the cabin I bought for myself in Door County, Wisconsin 3 years ago, back when I still thought I might need somewhere to retreat to for a weekend now and then. I never imagined I'd be living here full time. I never imagined a lot of things that turned out true. The coffee has gone lukewarm in my hands. Through the window, the water sits flat and silver, under a sky that can't decide if it wants to rain. Somewhere across that water, 300 guests are gathered at Larkspur Country Club dressed in linen and pearls, waiting for William Jenkins to hand his company to his oldest son. There are place cards. There's a string quartet. There's a cake with a small gold J on top because apparently even a baby who hasn't been born yet needs a monogram. I know all this because Rachel told me the itinerary 2 days ago in the flat, careful voice she uses when she's trying not to let her opinions show. Rachel Hayes has been my attorney for 11 years, and in all that time I have never heard her sound as tired as she did on that call. "You don't have to go," she said. "I wasn't planning to," I told her. The phone lights up again. Margaret. I let it ring 3 times before I answer because there's a version of me, the version who spent 23 years learning how to make herself smaller in that family's presence, who would have picked up on the first ring. That version doesn't live here anymore. Abigail. Margaret's voice arrives clipped and imperial the way it always does when she's frightened and trying not to show it. "Where are you?" "Somewhere you paid me quite a lot of money to disappear from," I say. 6 weeks ago, if memory serves. There's noise behind her chairs, scraping a man's voice, rising and falling, someone saying the word auditor like it's a curse. I picture the ballroom, the flowers wilting slightly under the heat of too many bodies, the string quartet faltering mid-phrase because nobody told them to stop. Madison somewhere near the front, in a pale blue dress, one hand resting on a belly that has become, in the last 6 months, the single most valuable asset the Jenkins family owns. "There's been a complication," Margaret says. "Something to do with a transfer. I need you to come explain it." "Explain what exactly?" "The $2 million, Abigail. Someone at the bank is asking questions about where it came from." I look down at the folder sitting on the table in front of me, thin and unremarkable, the kind of folder that could hold anything: tax documents, a grocery list, the end of a marriage. I already know what's inside it. I've known for 3 days. "That's strange," I say. "I was under the impression it came from your family's pockets. Isn't that what the paperwork said?" Silence. Then more noise. Caleb's voice, now sharp and close, wrestling the phone away from his mother. "Abigail, what did you do?" I picture him too easily, jaw-tight collar, too snug, the particular flush he gets when something isn't going according to plan. 23 years of marriage teaches you a man's face even when you can't see it. "I didn't do anything, Caleb, I say, and I mean it. I've been sitting at a lake all morning. I didn't write whatever letter just arrived at that club. I didn't call whatever bank flagged whatever it flagged. All I did was wait for the truth to show up on its own schedule instead of mine." "You knew," he says. "It isn't a question." "I knew what was possible," I say. "You're the one who decided to believe the rest." Madison's crying somewhere in the background, now a high performative sound I recognize from the night I signed those papers. William's voice cuts through, demanding someone call legal. Owen says nothing at all, which tells me more than anything else said in that room. "Come to the club," Caleb says. "Now, fix this." "There's nothing broken that I can fix," I say, "and nothing here that belongs to me anymore." I hang up before he can answer. I sit for a long moment with the phone dark in my hand, listening to the small sounds of the cabin, the refrigerator humming a loon calling somewhere out on the water. Then I open the folder and look again at the page on top, The one with Dr. Bennett's letterhead, the one that's been sitting in my possession for 12 years, quiet as a held breath. 6 weeks ago, they laid $2 million on a table in front of me and believed I'd just sold off my whole life for it. They had no idea I'd already seen the first result years before any of this began. To understand what's happening in that ballroom right now, you have to go back to the night they called me to the house, the night I learned exactly how little I was worth to them, and exactly how much they still didn't know. 6 weeks earlier, Caleb came home at 11 at night, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, he didn't bother pretending he'd been at the office. He stood in the doorway of our bedroom, still wearing his suit jacket tie loosened, and said it the way you'd announce a merger. "Madison's pregnant." I was sitting up in bed with a book I wasn't really reading. I remember setting it down, slowly giving myself that half second to arrange my face before I looked at him. 23 years of marriage teaches you things about timing. "Congratulations," I said, and I meant it to sting, though I'm not sure it landed the way I intended. He didn't flinch. That was the part that told me how far things had already gone without me. "It's a boy," he said, like the sex of the child settled something. "The family needs to move quickly, before this gets out." By the family, he meant his family. By moves quickly, I would learn within the hour he meant me. They sent a car for me that same night, not Caleb driving, but the Jenkins family car, black and silent, as if I were already a piece of business to be transported rather than a wife to be spoken with. I remember looking out the window at the streets of a city I'd lived in for 2 decades, and thinking how strange it was that none of it looked different when everything about my life was about to. The house on Willowmere Drive was lit up when I arrived, every window glowing like they were staging something for a magazine. And in a sense, they were. The living room held Margaret in a chair positioned like a throne, William, in his usual place by the fireplace, though he didn't rise when I entered, Caleb standing too close to Madison on the sofa, and Charles Whitmore, the family attorney, seated at the low table with a leather folder already open in front of him. Madison had one hand resting on her stomach, though she couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 weeks along. It was a gesture, not a fact. I noticed that immediately, how practiced it looked, how rehearsed. Charles slid the folder toward me before anyone said hello. $2 million. 7 days to vacate the house. Silence on the affair, permanent and binding. No contact with press. A full release of any claim to marital assets. No objection ever to Caleb's remarriage. I read every line twice while the room watched me, and I remember thinking that if they expected tears, they were about to be disappointed in a way that would cost them. "This is more than most women your age could hope to walk away with," Margaret said, folding her hands in her lap like she was doing me a kindness. Madison chose that exact moment to let a tear slide down her cheek, and Margaret reached over without looking to pat her knee, already choosing sides in a war that hadn't started for me yet. "I don't want to hurt you," Caleb said, and for 1 second I almost believed there was something underneath the words. "But this is the family's future." "Are you certain it's yours?" I asked. The room went still in the particular way rooms go still right before someone raises their voice. Caleb's face darkened. "Are you going to insult the mother of my child in this house?" Madison cried harder, right on cue, and Margaret was at her side, instantly murmuring something protective. I didn't argue. I had learned a long time ago that arguing with a room that has already decided the ending only wastes your breath. Instead, I made my own requests. I wanted the full $2 million wired that same night, not staggered, not delayed. I wanted every document notarized before I left the house. I wanted explicit language stating the payment did not touch any business shares held in my name. And I wanted it written that no terms could be altered after signing. Charles skimmed the shares clause quickly and told the room my holdings were negligible, a formality left over from the early years. Margaret, eager to be finished with me, agreed without argument. I signed. Madison smiled the way a woman smiles when she believes she's just won something permanent. Caleb exhaled like a man who'd been holding his breath for days. Margaret told me she knew I'd do the sensible thing. "You never actually knew me," I told her, and I watched that land somewhere behind her eyes, though she wouldn't have admitted it. Caleb followed me out to the car. He asked why I wasn't screaming, why I wasn't begging him to reconsider, why I wasn't behaving like a woman whose marriage had just ended in a room full of witnesses. Because I stopped fighting for things that had already lost their value. I said, and got into the car before he could find a response. The money landed in my account before midnight, exactly as I'd demanded. I sat at my kitchen table, still my kitchen, for 6 more days and went through the wire details with the kind of attention I'd once used auditing the company's quarterly filings, back when Caleb still asked for my opinion instead of assuming I had none. Receipt, routing number, timestamp, fund of origin. It didn't come from Margaret's personal account. It didn't come from William's either. It came from the Jenkins Legacy Trust, the fund reserved by charter for a confirmed future heir. I sat with that fact for a long time in the quiet kitchen, turning it over the way you'd turn over a stone to see what's living underneath. Then I picked up my phone and called Rachel Hayes. "They just paid me," I told her, "with money set aside for a child who hasn't been proven to belong to this family yet." I moved into a Marriott off Route 41 the next morning, the kind of place with a lobby smelling of chlorine and burnt coffee, nothing like the house on Cedar Brook I'd spent 18 years turning into a home. It felt right somehow. Starting over in a place that didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was. Rachel came by that afternoon with a legal pad and 2 coffees, and we spread the wire documents across the small round table by the window. She worked in silence for a while, the particular silence of someone doing math in her head. "This transfer needed board approval," she finally said. "Trust disbursements above a certain threshold always do. I don't see a full approval record here, just Margaret's signature and Charles's countersign." "Is that enough?" "For now. But if anyone ever looks closely, a payout from a fund meant for a confirmed heir made before any heir exists is going to raise questions. Trusts like this usually have a clause, an automatic audit trigger, if funds move without full verification of the beneficiary." She looked up at me. "You didn't give up your shares either. Whatever they think they bought from you, it wasn't that." I hadn't told her yet why I wasn't panicking, why I'd sat in that living room and signed my name without so much as raising my voice while Madison performed her tears 3 feet away. Rachel had represented me for over a decade, but there was one thing even she didn't know. I reached into my bag and took out an envelope I'd been carrying since the night before, its edges soft with age. 12 years old, I said, sliding it across the table. She opened it and read for a long moment, her expression shifting from confusion to something closer to disbelief. 12 years ago, Caleb had been diagnosed with early-stage prostate cancer. It caught him young before 40, and it frightened him in a way I'd never seen before or since. He went through treatment quietly, telling no one outside our marriage, terrified of what his father would think of a son who couldn't even keep his own body from failing him. When it was over, the follow-up results came back clear on the cancer. But there was another line in the report, one Caleb read 3 times before he could speak. Permanent infertility, a result of the treatment. Only 3 people ever knew Caleb, myself and Dr. Laura Bennett, who had cared for both of us for over a decade. Caleb made me promise more than once that his family would never learn it. I understood why. In that family, a man who couldn't produce an heir was worth less than the furniture. "So, when he told you Madison was pregnant," Rachel said slowly, "you already knew it couldn't be biologically possible." "I knew what should have been impossible," I said, "but people believe what they need to believe, especially men like Caleb. He convinced himself the old results didn't hold anymore, or that somehow this time things were different. Madison told him it happened at a conference months ago. He wanted a son badly enough that he stopped asking questions he already knew the answers to. I didn't want to build anything on memory alone, though. 12-year-old paper wasn't proof of anything happening now." I called Dr. Bennett that evening, and she confirmed the old file was still in the system, though she couldn't discuss it without Caleb's consent. Doctor-patient privilege didn't dissolve just because our marriage had. But there was something she didn't need his consent to tell me. Years earlier, when we'd tried fertility treatments together, I'd been named as a joint party on those records. I still had legal access to a portion of that file. That same week, almost as if the universe wanted to hand me one more piece, an email arrived from our old insurance provider. My name still hadn't been removed from the family policy in the confusion of the divorce filing. Buried in the notifications was a scheduling confirmation. Madison had booked a non-invasive prenatal paternity test. Results expected in 3 weeks. I read that line 4 times before I set the phone down. Rachel warned me immediately not to interfere. Don't tip them off, don't warn anyone. Let them put the truth on paper themselves, don't hand them a reason to bury it first. She was right, and I knew it, even as some old tired part of me wanted to walk into that house and lay it all out just to watch their faces change. I didn't. I'd spent 23 years being patient with that family. I could manage 3 more weeks. Meanwhile, the Jenkins public relations machine started turning. Statements went out quietly through mutual friends. The marriage had been over in every way but paper for years. I'd taken the settlement out of self-interest. Caleb and Madison had found each other during a difficult chapter and shouldn't be judged for it. A photographer was already booked for a future generation announcement shoot. Then 3 days before I left the hotel, I got a call from an old colleague still working in the finance department. She said legal had quietly requested her to adjust the approval date on a wire transfer, my wire transfer, to make it look like it had cleared the board weeks earlier than it actually had. That was the moment I understood. They weren't just hiding an affair anymore. They knew on some level that the transaction wasn't clean. That night a text arrived from a number I didn't recognize. If you want to know who really approved that money, ask Owen where he was the night Madison says she conceived. I read it twice, sitting alone in that hotel room with the hum of the highway outside the window, and felt something in my chest go very still and very cold. The woman texted me again the next morning, this time asking to meet. She introduced herself as Claire Morris, an audit assistant in the finance division, someone I vaguely remembered from company holiday parties, always polite, always in the background, the kind of employee who notices everything and says nothing until she has a reason to. She wasn't ready to meet in person yet, she said, but she wanted me to have something first. Over the next 2 days, she sent me pieces one at a time, like she was testing whether I could be trusted with the whole picture before handing it over. Owen had requested elevated access to trust fund records 6 weeks before Madison's pregnancy became public. He'd met with Madison multiple times outside any work schedule that made sense. There was a hotel charge in Milwaukee, the room booked under a name that didn't match anyone on the guest list for that week's supposed business trip. And Caleb hadn't even been in Milwaukee the night Madison claimed the child was conceived. I didn't believe it right away. 23 years with a man teaches you his lies, but it also teaches you not to trust every accusation that lands on your desk, especially one from a stranger. So I checked it myself. I still had access to an old shared calendar, one nobody had thought to remove me from in the chaos of the divorce. The night in question, Caleb had been in Denver with William and 3 board members locked in meetings about a stalled development deal. I remembered him complaining about it at the time, the long flight, the tedious contract language, how he'd missed my birthday dinner because of it. Madison had been in Milwaukee that same week. So had Owen. Once I let myself look, the smaller things came rushing back, things I'd noticed and dismissed for years, without letting myself add them together. Owen always stepping in to defend Madison whenever Caleb criticized her work. Madison knowing details about deals that should have stayed inside Owen's office. The 2 of them leaving the same holiday party within minutes of each other more than once. Owen more than anyone pushing Caleb toward a fast, clean divorce. Rachel, when I called her, was more cautious than I was. "Don't let this become a story you're telling yourself because it's satisfying," she said. "We need documents. We need the test results. Speculation doesn't hold up in a courtroom, and it definitely doesn't hold up in that family." She was right, and I made myself sit with the discomfort of not knowing, instead of rushing toward a conclusion that felt too convenient. Meanwhile, the Jenkins family moved forward as if none of this existed. A photographer was hired for a next generation announcement shoot. Caleb's hand resting proudly over Madison's still flat stomach. Both of them dressed in soft, neutral tones, meant to suggest new beginnings. Margaret called me that same week, her voice brisk and businesslike, asking me to sign an additional document, this one waiving my voting rights within the company entirely. I refused. That stake exists because of this family. Margaret said, clearly startled that I hadn't simply agreed. "No," I said. "I bought it with my own money back when the company was nearly bankrupt, and nobody else wanted to risk a cent on it. Nobody gave me anything, Margaret. I earned every percentage point." There was a long pause on the line, and I could almost hear her doing the math she should have done years earlier. 18%. That was what I still held quietly in a trust of my own, untouched by the divorce settlement, because I'd made certain of it the night I signed those papers. Without it, Caleb couldn't reach the voting threshold he needed to replace William as chairman. He called me an hour later, furious. "You tricked me." "No," I said. "You simply never read what I actually owned." That evening, Claire finally agreed to meet in person at a quiet diner off the interstate where nobody from either of our old lives would think to look. She slid a manila envelope across the table, a copy of the trust's approval log, the Milwaukee hotel records, and a small digital recorder. I pressed play right there in the booth, my coffee going cold in front of me. It was Owen's voice, unmistakable, low and confident in the way men get when they think no one important is listening. "We just need Caleb to believe the baby is his until the transfer of power is finalized." Madison's voice followed, quieter. "And Abigail, $2 million will make her disappear." I sat very still, listening to my own erasure being planned in real time by two people I'd once trusted enough to invite into my home. Claire watched my face carefully, as if gauging how much more I could absorb in one sitting. There was more on the recording, the sound of ice in a glass, a door closing somewhere in the background, and then Madison's voice again, this time with an edge I hadn't heard in her before, something colder underneath all that practiced softness. "And once Caleb has the company," she said, "what do we do with him?" 6 weeks after the divorce was finalized, the Jenkins family threw the kind of party they'd always been good at, the kind built on white tablecloths and rehearsed smiles, where every detail existed to tell a story about who they were rather than who they actually were. I know this only because Rachel described it to me afterward, piece by piece, since I wasn't there to see it firsthand. I'd chosen the lake instead. The guest list read like a who's who of everyone who mattered to the Jenkins name board members: investors, banking partners, old money friends who'd known William since his own father ran the company, and a scattering of relatives who showed up mostly for the open bar. The agenda, as Rachel understood it, was simple and triumphant: announce that Madison was carrying a boy, announce Caleb's engagement, have William formally hand over the reins of the company, to his son secure board approval for a new development phase, and present the unborn child as the living symbol of the family's stability for another generation. I sat with Rachel at my kitchen table that morning, instead going through 3 separate documents she'd prepared and quietly filed the day before. A formal notice preserving my shareholder rights, a request for an internal audit of the trust transaction, a motion to delay any vote on transferring executive control until that audit concluded. "Timing matters," Rachel had told me. "We don't stop them. We make sure the truth arrives at the worst possible moment for them to hide it." It arrived just before William was set to speak. An auditor from the trust's oversight firm walked into that ballroom uninvited by anyone but the paperwork itself, and asked to speak with the board privately before the formal remarks began. Word of it moved through the room the way bad news always does at parties like that, in whispers, in glances, in the sudden stiffness of people trying to look like nothing was wrong. The auditor's findings were simple and devastating. The $2 million disbursement had been drawn improperly from a fund reserved for a verified heir. The approval signature bore signs of having been added after the fact, not during the original transaction window. Until the discrepancy was resolved, any transfer of executive power would need to be paused, and the identity of the future heir himself would need to be formally verified before any further trust decisions could proceed. At almost the same moment Rachel believed it was less than 10 minutes later, a courier arrived at the club with a sealed envelope addressed to Caleb personally. The prenatal paternity results 3 weeks in the making had finally come back. Madison tried to intercept it. Caleb wouldn't let her. He opened it standing in front of nearly 300 people. The room went silent in the particular way rooms go silent when something has broken that can't be put back together. Caleb had been excluded as the biological father. Margaret called me within the minute, her voice sharp with panic rather than sympathy, demanding to know what I'd done. "Nothing," I told her, standing at my kitchen window watching the lake do what it always did, indifferent to everything happening 200 miles away. "I didn't write that result. I didn't call that auditor. I've been sitting here all morning." Caleb grabbed the phone from her, his voice cracking in a way I'd never heard from him before. "You knew." "I knew what was impossible," I said. "I let you decide what you wanted to believe instead." Madison, according to Rachel, insisted the test had to be flawed, some kind of laboratory error, her voice rising toward hysteria, in a room full of people who'd come dressed for a celebration. Owen tried to slip toward the exit. William, apparently moving faster than anyone expected from a 76-year-old man, physically blocked the door. The auditor clarified calmly that the confidence level on the results was extremely high, and that an expanded comparison panel indicated a close male relative of Caleb's was significantly more likely to be the biological father. Every eye in that ballroom turned to Owen. He denied it immediately, too quickly, the way guilty men always do. That was when I sent William and Charles Whitmore the recording Claire had given me, the one where Owen told Madison they only needed Caleb to believe the child was his until the transfer of power was complete. Rachel told me William listened to the whole thing, standing perfectly still in the middle of that ruined ballroom, his face unreadable, before he finally looked at his younger son. Caleb lunged at Owen. Security stepped between them before it went any further. Madison broke down completely, and in the chaos she finally admitted what should have been obvious from the beginning: she'd slept with both brothers. But it was Owen who had helped her plan every step of what came after. I sat at my kitchen table long after Rachel finished telling me all of it, the coffee gone cold in front of me, the lake still moving outside like nothing in the world had changed. Rachel's voice, when she called again that evening, was quieter than usual. "The DNA result only destroyed the lie about the baby," she said. "The financial records are going to destroy everything else they built on top of it." 3 days after the party, the family called an emergency meeting at the Jenkins Development Group headquarters, and this time, for the first time in 23 years, I walked into that building not as anyone's wife but as a shareholder, with a claim they could no longer dismiss. The conference room on the 14th floor held more people than I'd ever seen gathered for a single crisis. Caleb sat at one end, jaw set, refusing to look at his brother. Owen sat with his own attorney, now a stranger I didn't recognize, which told me everything about how far things had already fractured within that family. Margaret occupied her usual chair, though for once she looked smaller in it. William sat at the head of the table, his face carved from something harder than I'd seen before. Madison had come too pale, her hands folded over a stomach that had become in the space of 1 week evidence rather than triumph. Charles Whitmore sat beside a bank representative and an auditor, both of whom looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Rachel sat beside me. I'd asked her to let me speak for myself. Owen tried first to shift the blame entirely onto Madison, his voice clipped and defensive, insisting he'd only ever offered her advice as a friend. Madison wasn't having it. She turned on him with a bitterness that finally sounded honest, the performance stripped away for good. "He promised he'd marry me," she said, once Caleb was pushed out of the company. The plan, once it came apart fully on that table, was almost elegant in its cruelty. Use the child to accelerate Caleb into the chairman's seat. Once he held power, Owen would use the financial irregularities he himself had helped create, to force his brother out under a cloud of scandal. Madison would threaten to expose the affair if anyone resisted, and Owen, positioned as the reasonable, uninvolved brother throughout, would step in to take control of the company himself. The $2 million had been the opening move pulled from the trust specifically to remove me from the marriage and from any position to interfere with the transfer of power. What none of them had accounted for was that I still held 18% of the company, and with it the standing to demand a special audit. I laid out what I wanted, and I did it without raising my voice because I'd learned a long time ago that calm carries further in a room like that than anger ever could. The company would issue a public correction, no more implying I'd taken a payout for silence. The confidentiality agreement I'd signed would be rewritten so it could never again be used to bury wrongdoing. The $2 million would be reclassified as a legitimate personal settlement, drawn from Caleb's and the family's own assets, with full repayment made to the trust it had been improperly taken from. Owen would be suspended pending a formal investigation. Madison would be released from her position, though her medical and maternity coverage would remain fully protected. None of this was the child's fault. Caleb would not be appointed chairman. An independent director would run the company for no less than a year, and I would keep my shares along with my seat on the board. Margaret's composure finally cracked. "You're punishing us," she said. "This is revenge." "Revenge is wanting you to suffer," I said. "I only want you to stop using my name to cover up what you did." Caleb asked to speak with me privately for a moment, and I let him mostly because I wanted to see once and for all what was actually left of the man I'd married. He asked quietly if there had ever been a point where I'd tried to save our marriage. "I saved it for 23 years, I told him. "You just never noticed because I did it quietly." He admitted then, in a voice stripped of all its usual certainty, that he'd known for a long time his odds of fathering a child were nearly non-existent, but he'd wanted so badly to prove something to his father that he chose to believe Madison anyway chose to stop asking the questions that would have unraveled everything sooner. "You didn't love the baby," I said. "You loved what you thought the baby would prove about you." He had nothing to say to that. William, when the vote finally came, refused to hand control to either son. He cast his vote for the independent director instead, his voice flat and final, a man closing a chapter he'd clearly been rewriting in his head all week. Every condition I'd laid out was approved without further argument. Afterward, in the hallway outside the conference room, Caleb caught up with me one last time. "After all this," he said, "you're still keeping the $2 million? I looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had once been my whole life, and was now something closer to a stranger standing in a hallway. "No," I said. "I've decided to use it for something your family never understood. I never gave the $2 million back to Caleb." Under the terms we'd settled on in that conference room, the Jenkins family repaid the trust fund from their own personal holdings, dollar for dollar, exactly as it should have been from the start. What I'd received that first night was legally and finally, mind-clean, documented, no longer tangled up in anyone else's lie. I didn't buy a bigger house with it. I didn't buy a car meant to announce anything to anyone. Instead, I sat at the same pine table where this whole story had circled back to its beginning, and I started something with a name that came to me almost fully formed the way true things sometimes do. The Second Chapter Fund. It exists for women over 45 who find themselves starting over, after everything they built quietly falls apart around them. After divorce, after financial control wielded like a weapon after being pushed out of family businesses, they helped create after years spent raising children or supporting a spouse's career, only to re-enter a workforce that's forgotten they exist. Legal consultation, career retraining, short-term housing assistance, financial planning, counseling for the kind of grief that doesn't come with a funeral. I kept my seat on the Jenkins Development Group board because 18% doesn't disappear just because a marriage does, and because someone needed to make sure the company's new independent director actually held to the terms we'd agreed on. But I didn't go back to running things day to day. That chapter had already closed itself quietly over 23 years of me standing just behind the curtain. Caleb resigned as CEO 6 months later. He moved into a small apartment across town and started seeing a therapist, something I never once heard him consider necessary during our entire marriage. I don't know if it's helping him. I've stopped needing to know. Owen was formally charged with financial misconduct, falsifying trust records, and misappropriating funds meant for a beneficiary who never existed. The case is still working its way through the courts. Madison gave birth to a healthy boy that autumn. The DNA results, once fully processed, confirmed what the ballroom had already guessed: Owen was the father. I don't hate the child. I want to be clear about that even now. A baby doesn't answer for the lies that brought him into the world. Margaret lost most of her influence within the company almost overnight, the way power always seems to when it turns out to have been built on something hollow. William, for his part, restructured the trust entirely, placing it under independent oversight, so that no single family member could ever again decide alone who deserved to be called an heir. A year after that ballroom fell silent around a sealed envelope, I stood in the small office we'd rented for the fund's first real headquarters. Nothing fancy, just clean walls and good light, and a row of chairs for women who'd arrived not knowing quite how to ask for help. The first woman who walked through that door was 56, a widow 3 months out from discovering her late husband had quietly left the bulk of his estate to a second family she hadn't known existed. I sat down beside her instead of across from her, because I remembered what it felt like to be spoken to like a problem instead of a person. Starting over doesn't mean you've lost everything, I told her. Sometimes it just means you finally get to keep the one thing that was always actually yours. That evening, I drove back out to the lake house, the folder labeled Jenkins Divorce, still sitting in a drawer I hadn't opened in months. I set a new folder down beside it. Second chapter. Fund, first year. My phone buzzed on the table. It wasn't Caleb, it wasn't Margaret, it never is anymore. It was a message from one of our caseworkers, a woman we'd helped in March, had just accepted a job offer, her first paycheck in 11 years. I smiled at that alone in the quiet, the lake going dark and gold outside the window the way it does every evening around this time. They thought $2 million was the price of making me disappear. It turned out to be the money that finally let me show up again, not as anyone's wife, but as the woman I'd been putting off becoming for more than 20 years. If you were Abigail, would you have signed those papers and let the truth expose itself in its own time? Or would you have confronted Caleb the moment he walked through that door? I want to know where this story finds you tonight. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from. We have new stories like this one waiting for you every day, so subscribe and stay close because this is only the beginning of the journeys we'll take together.